There is a kind of loneliness that wealth and position cannot touch. It lives beneath the gold, beneath the titles, beneath the ceremonies, and the careful arrangements of powerful people managing one another's lives with the instruments of diplomacy and duty. It is the loneliness of a person who has been told, from the earliest age at which such things are communicated, that what they want is not the relevant question, that the relevant question is what they are for, and what they are for has been decided by forces much older and much larger than any individual desire. Prince Tayo of Akurin had carried this loneliness across an ocean. He arrived in England in the autumn of his 22nd year, aboard a vessel that the Kingdom of Akurin's diplomatic office had arranged with the careful attention to detail that all such arrangements required, an arrangement designed to communicate the appropriate messages to the appropriate people. He was not arriving as a student. He was not arriving as a curiosity or an exhibit, or one of the several categories that the Empire had developed for receiving visitors from its various territories and client states. He was arriving as a prince, the heir to a throne that controlled trade routes and natural resources that certain offices in London had spent 2 decades cultivating relationships to access. And the careful people in those offices understood the distinction and had communicated it to the relevant institutions. Oxford received him accordingly. He had rooms in a college whose walls had absorbed 5 centuries of English ambition and English certainty, and he moved through those walls with the particular quality of attention that had been his dominant characteristic since childhood. He watched. He listened with the completeness of someone who understands that information withheld from the powerful is still information, that the subtext of a conversation, the thing said in the pause before the official answer, often contains more than the official answer itself. He had been trained in statecraft from the age at which other boys were learning to ride horses, trained by a father who understood that his son would inherit a kingdom in the middle of a historical moment that would determine whether that kingdom survived into the next century with its sovereignty intact, or became another name on the administrative map of an empire that had never once asked anyone's permission to draw those maps. He was brilliant, and he knew it without vanity, which is the most useful way to know it. He absorbed law and political philosophy and the mechanisms of parliamentary governance with the focused efficiency of someone who is learning a system not to join it, but to navigate it on behalf of people who could not navigate it themselves. His tutors found him remarkable and occasionally unnerving. He had the habit, which some of them found impertinent and others found impressive, of identifying the contradiction between what a text said and what the social reality it described actually contained, of holding the ideal and the practice simultaneously in view and asking the question that the ideal preferred not to be asked. He had few friends in the ordinary sense. He had relationships that were carefully managed on all sides, relationships in which his title provided a kind of social insulation that was simultaneously an advantage and a barrier. The English aristocrats who came to Oxford understood the correct forms of address and applied them with the relieved precision of people grateful to have a category available. The young men who shared his tutorials approached him with the combination of fascination and wariness that most people brought to the proximity of something they could not quite categorize. There was goodwill, generally. There was also a persistent, subtle distance that he had come to accept as simply the temperature of the environment. He had not expected it to change. The winter gala at Pemberton College was one of those social occasions that the English academic world organised with the specific dual purpose of celebrating its own culture and demonstrating that culture's amplitude and confidence to any witnesses from outside it. The hall was dressed in the way of important English celebrations, the kind of dressing that had accumulated into a tradition so old it had lost any relationship to the original impulse and had become simply what was done, the evergreen and candlelight and silver, and the particular combination of formality and studied ease that the English upper class had refined over generations into something that looked effortless to people who had spent years practicing it. Tayo arrived in the formal dress that the occasion required, which he wore with the natural authority of a man who has been wearing formal dress at formal occasions since the age of 5 and has long since stopped being conscious of it. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of social competence and the private detachment of a man who is observing rather than participating, which was his habitual mode in rooms of this kind. He heard her before he saw her. She was arguing with 2 men across the room, not loudly, not with the theatrical volume of someone performing disagreement for an audience, but with the low, precise, slightly accelerating pace of someone who has found the exact weakness in the position being presented and is following that thread to its logical conclusion with the focused pleasure of a person who enjoys this kind of pursuit. The 2 men were holding their ground with the confidence of people accustomed to being listened to, and she was dismantling their ground with the patience of someone who has time and is not interested in being simply polite when being accurate is available. He moved closer. Not from social calculation, not from the habitual management of the room that he always applied. He moved closer because the argument was about Shelley and liberty and the specific question of whether poetry is capable of producing political change or merely reflects it. And it was the most interesting conversation he had encountered since arriving in England. And he was constitutionally incapable of remaining at a distance from an interesting conversation. Lady Vanessa Richmond was 20 years old and had the quality of presence that he had previously associated only with people who had spent decades developing it, the kind of presence that comes from being entirely and comfortably in possession of one's own mind, that does not require the room's approval to sustain itself. She was not performing the argument, she was having it. She looked up when he reached the edge of the conversation, and did not alter her expression in the way that people generally altered their expressions when a prince arrived in their vicinity. She looked at him with the assessing directness of a person who is evaluating whether a newcomer is likely to be useful to the argument, and then she said, without introduction or preamble, what he thought about whether Shelley's political idealism was weakened or strengthened by the formal constraints of his verse structure. He stood for a moment with the particular interior sensation of being surprised in a way he had not been prepared for, and then he told her exactly what he thought, which was a full and considered position that he had developed from his own reading and had never had occasion to share with anyone who would take it seriously. She disagreed with part of it. She told him so directly, and explained why, with specific references and a line of reasoning that he found genuinely challenging, and he pushed back, and she pushed back against the pushback. And the 2 gentlemen, who had been sustaining the previous version of the argument, drifted to the periphery with the expressions of people who have been replaced in a conversation and are not entirely sure when it happened. They talked for 3 hours. He walked away from the gala that night with the strange, disorienting sensation of a man who has been carrying a low-grade hunger for so long that he had stopped noticing it, and has then, without warning, been offered something real to eat. The friendship that began that evening was the kind that appears effortless from the outside because the people engaged in it are so entirely matched in what they require from conversation that the effort is invisible. They were both, in their different ways, people who had been told by the world to be other than they were, Tayo by the weight of a throne and a kingdom's expectations, Vanessa by the weight of a rank and a father's elaborate plans for her future. And they recognized each other's particular quality of contained impatience with the roles they had been assigned, with the immediate recognition of people speaking the same private language. They met in the college library, which was open to university guests, on Tuesday afternoons initially, and then on other days as the occasions and pretexts for crossing the campus multiplied. They corresponded between these meetings in letters that were officially about books, about the texts they were both reading, about the arguments they had not finished in person and needed to continue on paper, and that were also, underneath the official level, about something else that neither of them had yet named directly. She told him things she had apparently told no one, about the suffocation of a life designed entirely around her eventual marriage to someone appropriate, about the books she read in her room with the awareness that they were not the books her father expected her to read, about the reforms she believed in and argued for in private correspondence with people who took her seriously and in public silence with a father who did not. She spoke about these things with the frankness of someone who has held them too long and has finally found the right container. And he received them with the care of a man who understands that something offered directly and honestly deserves to be treated as the serious gift it is. He told her about a Corin. He had not spoken about his country to anyone at Oxford, not with any genuine specificity, because the contexts in which it had come up had always framed it as a territory or a policy question or a diplomatic relationship, never as a place he loved. He told her about the markets in the capital city at sunrise, about the quality of the light on the savannah in the late afternoon, about his father's court, and the music played at ceremonies, and the particular smell of the rains when they came after the dry season. He told her about the independence movement that was building throughout the continent, about the conversations he was having in London's unofficial spaces, in rooms where Africans from a dozen different territories gathered to think collectively about the question of what came next. He spoke about these things with the warmth of a person speaking about what is actually real to them, and she listened with the completeness of a woman who had been waiting without knowing it for something that was actually real. The winter moved towards spring, and the friendship moved towards something else, with the gradual inevitability of things that have always been heading somewhere and were only ever waiting for the right conditions. It was not dramatic or sudden. There was no single moment that could be identified as the moment. It was the accumulation of Tuesday afternoons and exchanged letters, and the particular way he looked at her when she was explaining something she felt strongly about, and the particular way she laughed when he said something that surprised her, and a day in March when they were walking along the river in the thin English spring sunshine, and he reached for her hand without planning to, and she let him keep it without pretending not to notice. They both understood what they were holding. The season that followed was the particular kind of season that some people are given once in their lives, and that shapes everything that comes after, whether they recognize it at the time or not. They were young, and they were in love, and they were both intelligent enough to understand that the world around them was not arranged to accommodate what they were to each other, and this understanding gave everything an edge that was part joy and part grief, simultaneously, the specific emotional texture of happiness that knows itself to be fragile. They took carriage rides to parts of Oxford and London that neither of their social worlds normally reached, places where they were simply two young people rather than a prince and a duke's daughter. They shared books and arguments and the long, comfortable silences of people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. They met in the library in the evenings when it was quiet, and the conversations that began about political philosophy arrived, by their own logic, at the private and the personal, and the evenings grew longer and the library grew quieter, and there were moments in that winter light when the world outside the walls of the room seemed very far away and entirely abstract. He knew, with the part of himself that was always the prince and never stopped being the prince, that this could not continue indefinitely without consequences. He was not naive about his position or his obligations, or the specific way in which the British colonial administration thought about the kingdoms it managed and the royals it dealt with. He understood that his presence in England was a diplomatic arrangement as much as an educational one, that he was being observed and his relationships were being noted, and that the observers would eventually reach conclusions that would be communicated to the relevant parties. He pushed the knowledge down. He kept it at a distance he could manage, because what was happening was the most alive he had felt since leaving a Corin, and aliveness is difficult to sacrifice, even when you know exactly what it will eventually cost. The Duke of Richmond came to visit his daughter on a Thursday in April. Tayo was not present for the conversation between them, but he did not need to be. He knew what had been communicated and approximately how, because he understood this particular world and the mechanisms through which information was used within it. The Duke was not a brutal man or a stupid one. He was a man who had spent 30 years in the colonial administration and had developed, through that experience, a particular and comprehensive understanding of how power worked and how to apply it without ever appearing to do so directly. He came to see Tayo separately, at the college, in the formal way of a man observing all the appropriate protocols of a meeting between equals or near equals, and he spoke with the smooth, measured reasonableness of a man who has thought through exactly what he wants to say and has organized it for maximum persuasive effect. He did not use any language that could be called hostile. He spoke about the complexity of the current political moment in the colonies, about the delicate balance of relationships between the emerging independence movements and the established administrative framework, about how precarious that balance was, and how important the personal relationships between key figures were to maintaining it. He spoke about Akorin specifically, about the conversations currently happening in certain government offices, about the terms under which independence might eventually be recognized, about the people in those offices and their dispositions, and what might alter those dispositions in one direction or another. He said these things with the tone of someone sharing useful information between parties who both understand the game, and what he was saying, underneath the measured language, was this. The kingdom Tayo would one day lead was dependent on British goodwill for its transition to sovereignty, and British goodwill was not unconditional, and the conditions under which it would be extended did not include a public scandal involving the Duke of Richmond's daughter. He said it all with perfect courtesy, and then he took his tea and he left, and Tayo sat in his college rooms afterward for a very long time looking at the wall. The Duke had not been wrong. That was the particular cruelty of it. He had not constructed a fiction or exaggerated the stakes. The political situation was exactly as he had described it, and Tayo's relationship with Vanessa was exactly the kind of visibility problem that the colonial administration would use as grounds for changing the terms of discussions that his father had spent a decade cultivating. He was not free to make this choice with only his own life as the cost. He was never free to make any choice with only his own life as the cost. This was the first thing princes learned, and the last thing they forgot. He thought about Vanessa. He thought about the library and the carriage rides, and the particular way she talked about the things she believed in, with the passionate, grounded conviction of a woman whose beliefs had been formed through genuine thinking rather than received from the environment. He thought about holding her hand on the riverbank in the March sun. He thought about Akorin. He thought about his father, who was not young and who had spent 30 years doing the careful, exhausting work of managing a kingdom through a historical moment that could go in any direction, who had sent his son to England not for experience or prestige, but because the son's education was a piece of a much longer strategy, a generation's worth of strategy. He aimed at a future in which the people of Akorin determined their own governance. He did not sleep that night. The summons from home arrived 6 weeks later. His father was ill. This was the sentence, and beneath it was the larger sentence, the one that the letter communicated in the careful language of court correspondence without stating directly, which was that the succession could not wait, that the political situation in Akorin was deteriorating in ways that required the heir's presence, that his studies in England had provided what they could provide, and the kingdom now required what only his return could provide. There was a second letter, from the council, which was more direct. Lady Elizabeth, daughter of the northern chieftain whose alliance was essential to the stability of the throne, was waiting. The marriage had been discussed for years. The timing was no longer something that could be deferred. He sat with the 2 letters, and felt the life he had been living for the past 8 months become, in the space of 2 pieces of paper, entirely theoretical. Like a door that has been visible from across a room and that you have been approaching without admitting to yourself that you were approaching it. And then suddenly you are standing at it, and it is closed. And the question of whether it was ever truly open is no longer a useful question. He could not take Vanessa to Arcarin as his wife. This was not a sentiment. It was a structural reality, the reality of a throne that required the Northern Alliance, of a people whose trust in their future king was contingent on his demonstrated loyalty to the obligations they understood him to have, of a political moment in which a foreign wife from the colonizing power would not be understood by the people he was meant to lead as a personal choice, but as a political signal of the most damaging kind. He could not explain this in a way that would feel like anything other than what it also was, which was a choice, because everything that has structural causes is also a choice made by the person who honors the structure rather than breaking it. He did not tell her about the letters immediately. He carried them for 3 days, which was 3 days of seeing her and talking with her, and holding in his body the knowledge of what was coming, the way you hold a breath that is becoming painful, but that releasing will cost more than holding. He told her on a Wednesday evening in the library, in the room where they had spent hundreds of hours that were already becoming the past tense, even as they were still happening. He told her his father was ill, and the succession required his return. He told her about Lady Elizabeth and the Northern Alliance in the way that people speak about the most devastating truths when they are trying to be honest while also being cowardly, which is with specificity about the facts and silence about the feelings. He told her that he had no right to ask her to wait, because he could not offer a future that did not destroy everything he had been sent here to protect. She was quiet for a long time after he stopped speaking. She sat across from him in the library chair with the particular stillness of a woman who is feeling a great deal and has decided, by an act of will, to feel it completely rather than deflect it into something more manageable. She was not going to perform shock or collapse. She was not going to say things designed to make him feel better about what he was doing. She was going to sit with what it was. She said finally that she understood the obligation, that she did not pretend not to understand it. She said that she wanted him to know that she believed the obligation was real and that she respected it, and that none of this made what she felt about it any smaller. She said these things with the precision of a woman who is choosing her words with care because the words are the only thing she can control. He reached across the table and held her hand for the last time in that library, and neither of them said anything further, because there was nothing further to say that would improve on what had already been said. He left London the following week without arranging a final meeting. He made this choice deliberately, and he knew it was cowardly, and he made it anyway, because he understood that if he saw her again, he would not be able to sustain the decision he had made, and sustaining the decision was not optional. And a man who allows himself to be seen failing to sustain a necessary decision is in some respects more culpable than a man who simply goes. He told himself this. He spent the journey home telling himself this with the compulsive repetition of someone who does not quite believe the argument he is making, but does not have a better one. Arcarin received its prince with the ceremony and the joy of a people who had been waiting for the steadiness that a confirmed succession would provide. He saw his father, who was older and thinner than he remembered, and who looked at his son with the eyes of a man reading a text he has waited a long time to finish. And the reunion between them had a quality of reality that was itself a kind of anchor, the specific weight of a life that is actually your life rather than the life you are living in, the time borrowed from it. He married Lady Elizabeth in the rainy season, in the ceremony his father had always envisioned for it, with the traditions that had marked these occasions for generations, and that carried the full weight of everything they were meant to carry. Elizabeth was kind and intelligent and entirely composed, a woman who had been prepared for this role as thoroughly as he had been prepared for his, and who brought to it the same combination of genuine ability and disciplined acceptance that any person brings to a life they did not design themselves. He was good to her. He was attentive and respectful, and did everything that his role required him to do. He did not love her the way the library had taught him love could be, but he understood that the library was not where kings learned their emotional vocabulary, and he managed the distance between what he felt and what the situation required with the control that had been his defining characteristic since childhood. His father died in the second year of his marriage, and Tayo became king, and the throne settled onto his shoulders with the weight that the people who had built it had always intended it to carry. He was good at it. He had been trained for it, and he was intelligent, and he cared, genuinely and specifically, about the people who were his responsibility in the way that the best kings always have. He navigated the independence negotiations with the patience and precision his father had modelled, by using the education in English law and the networks he had built at Oxford to read the administrative language with the fluency of someone who had been inside the system and understood where its real mechanisms were. He moved his kingdom, in those years, with careful deliberation toward the future his father had always intended. He was powerful, and he was competent, and he was lonely, with a quality of loneliness that power intensifies rather than remedies. The loneliness of a man who has had, once, the experience of being genuinely known, and who has spent every year since measuring every subsequent relationship against that standard and finding the distance. In London, Vanessa Richmond was becoming something the world had not particularly planned for her. The grief of the library had not destroyed her, which she had not been certain it would not in the immediate weeks that followed. It had done something different. It had stripped away a certain quality of deference she had been maintaining toward the life her father had imagined for her, a quality of going through the appropriate motions while reserving her real self for the private spaces. She stopped reserving. She took the real self into the public spaces instead, with a directness that her father found alarming, and that certain editors and reform societies found essential. She wrote. She had always written, but she had written in the way of a woman who is not sure if she is allowed to mean it, and she stopped being unsure. She published essays in journals that reached audiences her father had never imagined speaking to, essays about empire and governance, and the treatment of colonized peoples that were grounded in a specificity of research and a clarity of argument that could not be dismissed by people who tried. She corresponded with reformers and abolitionists and the growing number of voices across the empire's territories who were articulating, in different languages and from different positions, the same fundamental set of questions about what the empire was for and who it served. She refused the suitors her father presented, each one carefully selected, each one representing a version of the future the Duke had always envisioned for his daughter. She refused them with the impeccable courtesy of a woman who has decided that courtesy is the form she will maintain, while meaning is the substance she will not compromise. Her father expressed his frustration in various registers of displeasure, and eventually arrived at a kind of resigned acknowledgement that was not acceptance, but was the absence of further active resistance. She did not marry. She lived with a quietness about this particular fact, neither explaining it nor defending it, occupying the independence of a woman with her own means and her own work and her own world, with the steady self-possession of someone who has decided that this is enough, or has decided to act as though it is enough, which is not quite the same thing, and which she did not examine too closely. She thought about Tayo with the controlled regularity of someone managing a condition, regularly enough that it did not accumulate into something that needed to be addressed, so infrequently enough that the ordinary days could be what they needed to be. She thought about him when she read certain things, and when she walked in certain weather, and when she encountered an argument in the library of a person she was visiting that reminded her of the specific quality of his mind, its combination of rigor and warmth, its ability to hold complexity without resolving it prematurely. She wrote him one letter, in the 3rd year after his departure. It was not a love letter. It was careful and honest, and said the things that she thought were worth saying, that she hoped the kingdom was going well, that she had read about the independence negotiations with interest, that she had written something that had made some people uncomfortable and was glad, that she was well and working and did not want him to worry. She said at the end that she thought about their conversations often and that they had mattered to her, and that she hoped, wherever life had taken him, that the things he had cared about were still intact. She sent it to the palace, and she did not expect a reply, and no reply came. And she told herself that this was because his life was full and complex, and the administration of a kingdom left little room for correspondence with English writers from one's university years. The truth, which she did not know, was that the letter had been read by people who were not Tayo before it reached him, that the correspondence arriving at the palace from England was reviewed by a council whose interest in the king's external relationships was both protective and territorial, and that this particular letter, from this particular person, had been summarized for Tayo in the sanitized language of a council report that contained the names of several English suitors who were apparently pursuing the writer's acquaintance, which was true in the sense that several men had been persistent in their attentions toward her, and was presented in a context designed to communicate that she had moved on. He received this information with the stillness he brought to everything difficult, and filed it in the internal place where he kept the things he was not going to examine. She wrote 2 more letters over the following years. Neither reached him as written. He sent no letters because he was a king, and she was the chapter of his life that had been closed, and he was not a man who reopened closed things, which was also to say that he was a man who had learned, at great cost, to leave alone the things whose examination would cost more than he could afford. They were both, in their different countries and their different lives, living within the shapes that had been made for them by other people's decisions, and calling it adulthood, and getting on with the day. Paris, in the autumn of the 12th year, was cold in the particular way of European cities that retain the heat of their stone all summer, and release it into the October air as a kind of ambient warmth that is pleasant until the November rains arrive and wash it away. The diplomatic summit had been organized around the question of trade agreements and territorial boundaries, and all the other formal categories through which empires discuss the management of the world without ever naming directly what they are managing. And Tayo had come as a king, whose country was now 3 years into its formal independence, and whose presence at these gatherings was itself a kind of argument about the changed shape of things. He was older in the ways that 12 years make a man older, more settled in the body, more economical in expression, carrying the specific weight of a person who has been responsible for a great many people for a long time and has learned to distribute that weight across his whole self rather than holding it in any one place. He crossed the ballroom at the opening reception of the summit with the deliberate ease of someone moving through a social environment that holds no particular surprises, speaking with the appropriate people, observing the appropriate forms. He had done this 100 times in a dozen countries, and he did it with the practiced competence of a man whose public self has been refined by years of precisely this kind of occasion. He turned, in the middle of a conversation with a French minister, about something that the following morning he would not be able to recall with any specificity, and saw her. She was across the room at a diagonal. She was speaking with 2 men he did not recognize, and she was doing so with the specific quality of engaged, directed attention that he had always associated with her, the way she inclined toward conversation when it interested her, the slight quickening of expression that signaled the moment an argument began to develop. She was older, as he was, and the years were visible in the particular way they were visible in faces that have been living actively, the face's record of what it has been through, written in the texture of expression rather than in any diminishment. She was more beautiful. He registered this with the flat honesty of an observation, neither welcomed nor resisted, simply noted. She had not seen him yet. He had perhaps 4 seconds in which to make a decision about whether to move toward her or to manage the room in a direction that would make the encounter less likely. And he stood in those 4 seconds with the knowledge that both options were available and the absolute inability to choose the manageable one. She looked up. The moment of recognition travelled across the ballroom between them like a current. The specific sensation of something that has been kept very still for a very long time moving again. He saw it in her face, and understood that it was also in his. That whatever control he had developed over 12 years of kingship was not adequate to the task of managing this particular ambush. They moved toward each other through the geometry of the room, with the inevitability of things that have been suspended for a long time, and have simply, in the presence of the right conditions, resumed their natural motion. They spoke with the careful formality of the diplomatic context, her name and his title, and the appropriate pleasantries of 2 people who have a history and have agreed, without discussing it, to handle that history with the public restraint that the occasion required. He asked about her work. She asked about the kingdom. They exchanged information with the crisp efficiency of people using language as insulation against what is actually happening between them. And what was actually happening between them was the full weight of 12 years landing simultaneously, the accumulated absence of all that time becoming present and specific in the 8 inches of ballroom air between them. They danced once, later in the evening, when the reception had moved into the more general social territory that such gatherings reach after the formal business has been discharged and the wine has been flowing for an appropriate number of hours. It was arranged with the naturalness of things that are not accidental, but that both people prefer to experience as natural, and it was a waltz, which provided the structure of physical proximity without requiring any decision about it. He held her in the formal way the dance required, at the correct distance, in the correct posture, and she matched it with the social composure she had clearly developed in the years since Oxford, and they moved through the measures of the music in the middle of a ballroom full of diplomats and ministers and their various attachments, and said nothing for a full minute. She said, finally, that she had not expected to see him. He said that he had not known she would be here. She said that she was covering the summit for a journal. He said that she was still writing. She said that she was always writing. She said this with a small quality of irony directed at herself, at the fact of what her life had become, and he heard in it the same private register he had always heard in her when she was being honest rather than polite. He said that he had read some of what she had published. He said this without embellishment, because embellishment would have been false, and what was not false was simply that in the years he had spent doing the work that the world required of him, he had sometimes, in the evenings, when the council chambers were empty and the correspondence was finished, looked for her name in the journals that arrived at the palace, and found it, and read what she had written, and felt, in the reading, the specific sensation of someone who is far from a window catching a draught of outside air. She looked at him then with an expression he could not read completely, something complex and layered, and the music moved through its final measures, and the dance ended, and they separated with the correct formalities, and he spent the rest of the evening managing his attention away from her location in the room with the focused effort of a man trying not to look at a wound. He left Paris 2 days later without seeking another conversation. He told himself this was discretion. He told himself this was the appropriate behavior of a king who had obligations and a wife and a kingdom, and a reputation that existed not for his benefit, but for the benefit of the people it represented. He told himself these things across the entire journey home, and none of them were false, and none of them were the only truth. The coup came in the 16th year, It was not a sudden thing, in the way that coups are never truly sudden to the people who have been watching the internal politics closely enough, though they are almost always experienced as sudden by everyone outside the immediate centre. The Northern Alliance had been fracturing for years, the result of economic pressures and generational changes within the chieftain's family, and the accumulated resentments of a population whose expectations of independence had included improvements that had not arrived at the speed that expectations always demand. The faction that moved against him was well organized and had outside support that he had known about in general terms, but had been unable to fully map before it became operational. The palace fell in 2 days. He was not killed, which was a political calculation on the part of the new regime, a calculation about what his death would cost them internationally versus what his exile would cost him personally, and the calculation had come out in favor of exile. He left Akorin with his name and the clothes he stood in, and the particular quality of a man who has had everything that defined his public self stripped away in 48 hours, and is standing in the ruins of his own story, trying to determine what is left. What was left was the man, not the prince, or the king, or the heir, or the diplomatic asset, or any of the categories that had organized his existence since birth. Just the man who had grown up in those courts and studied in those libraries and stood on that riverbank in the March sun, holding a woman's hand in a country that was not his own. He went to London. He did not go with a plan or a strategy, or any of the organized intentionality that had characterized every previous major movement of his life. He went because it was a city he knew, where he had professional and social connections that still operated, where the diplomatic circles he had moved in would provide at least the minimal infrastructure of a life while he determined what that life was going to be. He went because it was the city where the most real thing that had ever happened to him had happened, and because people, when they are lost, tend toward the places that were once real. He found her address through a mutual acquaintance, which was easier than he had expected, because she was not hiding. She had become a figure of sufficient public presence that her professional address was effectively public information, the kind of information that anyone who read the journals she published in would eventually encounter. He wrote her a letter. It was the first letter he had written her in 16 years, and it was not easy in the way that nothing truly important is easy to write, the way that anything worth saying contains within it the awareness of all the things that cannot be unsaid and all the time that cannot be recovered. He said that he was in London. He said that he understood if she had no interest in renewing a connection that he had handled with very little credit to himself. He said that he would like, if she were willing, to speak with her. She came the following week to the rooms he had taken in a quiet part of the city, which were adequate and anonymous and nothing like the spaces he had previously occupied, which suited him in his current state better than spaces that required him to perform something he was not yet sure he had. She sat across from him and looked at him with the direct, complete attention that had always been her mode, the attention that did not edit or soften what it was seeing, and he sat with that attention on him and felt, not uncomfortably, entirely seen. They talked for 3 hours, and this time the conversation was not about Shelley or agricultural reform or the mechanisms of parliamentary governance. It was about all of it, all of the years and the choices and the things that had been true at the time and the things that had not been true and the difference between them. She had known, she told him, that the Duke had spoken to him. She had worked this out in the weeks after his departure and had arrived at a clarity about what had actually happened that had been, she said with the dry precision she brought to difficult things, both comforting and infuriating in equal measure. She told him about the letters she had sent. He told her about the council summaries. She was quiet for a long time with this information. She said that she had built her life in the years of his absence around the assumption that he had made his choice and that her work was to make something sufficient from what remained. She said that she had, in fact, done this, and that what remained had been a great deal more than she had initially feared, and that she had been, in the ways that counted, genuinely alive in those years. She said all of this clearly, because she was done with the kind of romantic dishonesty that either exaggerates suffering for effect or minimizes it for pride. He said that he had done the same in a different country, with different instruments, and that the same qualification applied, that he had been alive in those years and had done work he was proud of and had loved people with the portion of himself that was available for loving, and that none of this was the full truth of his experience, any more than her summary was the full truth of hers. She said that she was furious at him for leaving without saying goodbye properly, that she had been furious about this for 16 years, and that his arrival in London did not automatically resolve the fury, and she said this without melodrama, as a statement of fact that she thought he was owed. He said that she was right to be furious. She said that being told she was right to be furious was not the same as an adequate accounting of the decision, and she said this with the particular edge of a woman who has had many years to develop her position on the subject and is not going to be pacified with concession alone. He said that he had believed, which was true, that by leaving as he had, he was protecting her from the specific damage that a prolonged and public separation would have done to her position and her family's position in the social world they moved in, and that he had been wrong about whether this belief justified the method, and that the wrongness of it had become clearer and not less clear as the years passed. She said that he had not trusted her to decide what she was willing to bear. He said yes. He said it was the truest thing and the most difficult, and that it was the one thing he had done that he could not make an argument for, that every other choice in those years had at least the structure of an argument, even when the argument was insufficient, but that one had been simply a failure of courage, dressed as consideration, and that he had known it at the time, and had done it anyway, and he was sorry for it. She was quiet for a long time after he said this. Then she said that she would like to take a walk. They walked in the late afternoon light of a London November, which was grey and cold and soft in the specific way of English winter light, through streets she knew well, and he was relearning, and they talked about other things, easier things, about her current work, and the political situation in Corinne, and the summit in Paris, and the books they had each read in the past year that had seemed worth reading. They talked with the ease of people who have had the difficult conversation and are now on the other side of it, where the ground is different, but it is at least ground. She did not offer him anything that evening beyond the conversation, and he did not ask for anything. They parted outside the rooms where he was staying, in the street, and she pulled her coat against the cold and looked at him with an expression that was not resolved into anything clean or simple, because the situation was not clean or simple, and she was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. She said that she would like to continue the conversation. He said that he would like that also. She said tomorrow, then, and he said tomorrow. And she walked away down the street in the grey November light, and he stood in the cold and watched her go and felt, for the first time in more years than he was going to count, the specific sensation of being in the right place. The months that followed were not a courtship exactly, because they were both too old and had been through too much for the word courtship, with its implication of sequential steps toward a predetermined destination, to apply. What they were was two people who had been living parallel lives and were now, carefully, cautiously, with the specific wariness of people who have both been made to pay a great deal for trusting the future, beginning to allow those lives to occupy the same space. They walked in parks and attended lectures and ate in restaurants and argued about everything they had always argued about, with the addition of 30 years of material that they had both accumulated independently and were now bringing into the shared space for the first time. They were both different from the people they had been at Oxford. They were more themselves, in the way that people who have had to be themselves without the support of another person tend to become more clearly themselves over time, the way that solitude carves definition. They fit together differently than they had at 22. Better in some ways, more complicated in others, more honest. He did not return to Akorin, not in the way that had previously defined his relationship to it, not as its king or its prince or its diplomatic representative, and he followed the political situation in the country with the attention that someone who loves a place always maintains for news of it, and he worked through the exile community in London in quiet ways, contributed to funds and to planning conversations and to the networks that maintained the connection between Akorin's people and the advocates for their continued sovereignty. But he did so as a private individual rather than as a claimant, because the claim was gone, and he had examined it from every angle available and had concluded that the pursuit of it would consume what remained of his life, and that what remained of his life had other uses that he preferred. He had never, in all his years as king, chosen what his life was for. He had always inhabited a choice that had been made for him before he was old enough to evaluate it. He was evaluating it now, for the first time, at the age of 52, in a city that was not his own, but that had been the location of the only thing he had ever chosen freely, and the evaluation was arriving at a conclusion that would have seemed, to the young prince who had arrived at Oxford 30 years ago with the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, both improbable and, he thought, right. He told her, in the garden of the house she had rented in the part of London that looked most like the country, on a spring afternoon that had the quality of English spring afternoons, thin and cool and full of the specific promise of warmth that English springs always offer without being entirely sure they can deliver, that he was not going back. Not as king. Not as anything that required him to be other than he was. He told her that he was aware of what he was not offering, that he was not a young man, and not a powerful man, and not a man with a title or a throne, or anything that the world had previously used to measure him, and that what he was offering was simply the man, the one that had been underneath all of those categories all along, and that he thought she had seen, perhaps more clearly than anyone else had ever seen it, 30 years ago in a library in Oxford. She looked at him in the garden in the spring light, and she did not say anything immediately, because she was processing something that deserved to be processed, rather than responded to reflexively. And he waited with the patience of someone who has learned, at great cost, the value of waiting. She said that 30 years was a very long time to be a footnote in someone else's story of themselves. He said yes, it was, and that he was not asking her to be a footnote. He was asking her, if she was willing, to be the story, the one that had always been the story, underneath everything else. She said that the Duke was still alive and would have opinions. He said that the Duke's opinions were the Duke's business. She said that she was 35 years beyond the age at which any of this was expected of her, and that she had built a life she was not willing to dismantle. He said that he was not asking her to dismantle anything. He was asking if there was room in the life she had built for him. She looked at him for a long time in the garden. She looked at him with the complete, unhurried attention she had always brought to everything she considered genuinely important. She was thinking, he could see her thinking, working through something with the same methodical intelligence she had always applied to arguments that mattered, and he let her work because the answer she arrived at through that process would mean something that an answer arrived at quickly could not mean. She said yes, not dramatically, not with tears or elaborate declaration. She said yes, with the same directness she had always used for things she meant, and it had the weight of everything it contained, which was 30 years and 2 countries, and a library in winter, and a riverbank in March, and all the ordinary unmemorable days that stretched between those landmarks and made up the actual texture of 2 lives. They sat in the garden, as the afternoon light moved across the grass in the slow way of spring afternoons, and they talked about small things, about the garden and the neighbourhood, and a book he had been reading, and an essay she was working on. They talked in the way of people who are beginning to understand that they have time, not the false abundance of youth, which does not know its own scarcity, but the real and finite and therefore precious time of people who understand exactly how much it costs and have decided to spend it here. He had a map of Akorin. He carried it with him the way people carry things that are too important to put down even when they are not looking at them. A map that was old and worn at its folds. That showed the country as it had been when he had left it, and that he knew no longer matched the administrative reality of what the new regime had redrawn. He took it out of his coat, which was a thing he sometimes did when he was sitting somewhere quiet, and he looked at it in the garden light, at the coastline and the river systems and the city and the northern territories, and the roads and the features that a map can capture, which is the physical shape of a place, but not the thing that makes a place what it is. He looked at the map for a long time, with the expression of a man saying goodbye to something he loves, which is different from the expression of a man who no longer loves it. The love was intact. It would remain intact. He was not severing anything or denying anything. He was acknowledging that love and the life you build from what is left are not always in the same place, and that the acknowledgement is not a betrayal. He folded the map. He put it in his pocket, carefully, the way you handle something you want to keep. And he reached across the bench in the spring garden and took Vanessa's hand, which she gave him without pulling her attention away from the essay notes she was reviewing, in the easy, unperformed way of two people for whom physical proximity has become the baseline rather than the event. She made a small note in the margin of her page and looked up and looked at him, at the man who had arrived in England 30 years ago with a kingdom on his shoulders and had arrived here with nothing but his name, which was the thing he had always had and the only thing that had always been simply his. She said that she was glad he had come back. He said that he was sorry it had taken so long. She said that she thought they had time. The afternoon continued around them in the garden, the light moving as it always moves, indifferent to the weight of what it illuminates. The birds and the wind and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary London street beyond the wall. Two people on a bench. Two people who had spent a lifetime being other things and had arrived, finally, at the most difficult and the most simple thing of all, which is the choice to be exactly what you are, with exactly the person you love, in exactly the time that remains. The garden held them in its spring light. The map rested in his pocket. The essays spread across the bench between them, caught the afternoon breeze, and she weighted them with her palm. He looked at her, and she looked at the page, and then she looked at him. And the expression between them was not dramatic or cinematic in the way that long-anticipated moments are supposed to be. It was quieter than that, and more permanent. It was the expression of two people who have stopped performing and started being, who have crossed out of the territory of what they were supposed to want and into the territory of what is actually true. Outside the wall, the city continued its business, indifferent as cities always are to the private revolutions occurring within their boundaries. The empire that had organized their first encounter was itself in the process of becoming something different. The long, slow historical shift already underway that would, in the decades ahead, change the map of the world more completely than either of them would live to see fully. The kingdoms and the titles and the contracts were already beginning to mean different things than they had meant. What did not change was the garden. What did not change was the bench and the afternoon light and the worn map in his pocket and her hand in his and the 30 years of separate living that had arrived here at last, at the simplest and the most earned thing. Two people in a garden in spring, finally home.